the mist-shrouded mountains of 16th-century Hungary, where Gothic spires pierced the sky like accusing fingers, there lived a woman whose name would become synonymous with terror itself. She was born into nobility, blessed with wealth beyond measure, beauty that could stop hearts, and power that could break them. But beneath the silk gowns and jeweled crowns festered something darker than the deepest dungeon, something that would transform a countess into a monster and turn her castle into a slaughterhouse. This is the story of Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess, a woman who believed that youth could be stolen from the veins of virgins, that beauty could be bathed in blood, and that power gave her the right to harvest human lives like wheat in her fields. What you're about to hear will chill you to the bone, because sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who smile at you from behind castle walls. The year was 1560. In the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, a daughter was born to one of Hungary's most powerful families. Elizabeth Báthory entered a world where her bloodline was currency, her name was law, and her future seemed written in gold. The Báthory family ruled Transylvania as virtual kings, their influence stretching across kingdoms like spiderwebs across a crypt. From her first breath, Elizabeth was different. She was beautiful, hauntingly so, with pale skin that seemed to glow in candlelight and dark eyes that held secrets even as a child. But there was something else lurking behind those eyes. Servants whispered of strange fits that would seize the young girl, moments when she would rage with inhuman fury, her small hands clawing at anyone within reach. They blamed it on illness, on the devil, on the cursed blood that ran through noble veins. They had no idea how prophetic their whispers would prove to be. At 11 years old, Elizabeth was promised in marriage to Ferenc Nadasdy, a union designed to merge two of Hungary's most influential dynasties. But this was no fairy tale wedding. Ferenc was known as the Black Knight of Hungary, a man whose reputation for cruelty and warfare was matched only by his savage treatment of enemies. He was a perfect match for Elizabeth in ways that no one could have predicted. The castle that would become Elizabeth's domain rose from the Hungarian countryside like a stone monument to power and terror. Bathe Castle, with its towering walls and labyrinthine corridors, would become the stage for horrors that historians still struggle to comprehend. Within these walls, Elizabeth would learn that power could corrupt not just the soul, but the very essence of humanity itself. In the early years of her marriage, Elizabeth seemed content to play the role of noble wife. She bore children, managed vast estates, and entertained guests with the grace expected of her station. But Ferenc's frequent military campaigns left her alone for months at a time, alone with her thoughts, her servants, and her growing appetite for something darker than mere noble privilege. It began with discipline. Elizabeth noticed that her servant girls sometimes made mistakes, spilled wine, dropped dishes, failed to maintain the standards of perfection she demanded. At first, her punishments were conventional for the era: beatings, confinement, withdrawal of food. But gradually, something twisted began to emerge from her methods of correction. She discovered that she enjoyed the fear in their eyes. She relished the moment when defiance crumbled into terror. The power to inflict pain became intoxicating, more addictive than wine, more satisfying than any pleasure her noble life could offer. And with each punishment, the boundaries of cruelty expanded like ripples in a dark pond. The transformation accelerated after Ferenc's death in 1604. With her husband gone, Elizabeth was free to explore the darkest corners of her nature without restraint. The castle that had once hosted grand banquets now echoed with screams. The chambers that had welcomed noble guests now concealed instruments of torture that would make even hardened soldiers weep. Her victims were young girls, mostly peasants from surrounding villages, drawn to the castle by promises of work as servants. They came seeking bread and shelter, but found only horror beyond their darkest nightmares. Elizabeth's methods were as creative as they were cruel. She would jam pins and needles under fingernails, watching with fascination as blood welled up like tiny red flowers. She would tie girls naked in the courtyard during winter, pouring water over their bodies until they froze into human sculptures of agony. But these were merely the opening acts of a much darker performance. Elizabeth had developed a theory, a twisted belief that would drive her to depths of depravity that still shock us centuries later. She believed that youth itself could be stolen, that beauty could be preserved not through prayer or potion, but through blood, virgin blood, the blood of innocence itself. The legend speaks of bathing, of Elizabeth submerging her pale skin in tubs filled with the warm blood of murdered girls. But the reality was even more grotesque. Witnesses testified to contraptions of horror: iron cages suspended from castle ceilings, their floors designed with movable steel blades. A girl would be locked inside, and as the blades slowly closed, Elizabeth would stand beneath, letting the blood rain down upon her like a crimson benediction. She believed this ritual would preserve her beauty, that each drop of virgin blood would steal a day from death itself. The younger the victim, the more potent the effect. She hunted for girls who had never known a man's touch, believing their untainted blood held the strongest magic. In her twisted mind, murder had become a sacrament of eternal youth. For over 2 decades, this horror continued unabated. By 1611, investigators had collected over 300 witness statements. The number of victims remains disputed, with estimates ranging from dozens to over 600 souls. Village after village in the surrounding countryside began to empty of young women. Families locked their daughters away, but Elizabeth's reach was long, her servants efficient in their grisly harvest. The castle itself became a charnel house. Bodies were buried in secret graves beneath the chapel floor, thrown into rivers under cover of darkness, or simply left to rot in hidden chambers that servants feared to enter. The very stones of Chejte seemed stained with blood, the air thick with the spiritual weight of uncounted murders. But Elizabeth's downfall would come not from the deaths of peasant girls. Their lives meant little to the nobles who ruled Hungary. Her mistake was expanding her hunting grounds to include the daughters of minor nobility. When girls of gentle birth began disappearing, when their families demanded answers, the protective veil of her station began to fray. King Matthias of Hungary, pressured by increasingly vocal complaints, finally ordered an investigation. In December 1610, György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, led a raid on Chejte Castle. What they discovered there defied belief even by the brutal standards of the age. They found Elizabeth in the midst of her work. In the castle's lower chambers, investigators discovered torture devices still warm with use, cells filled with girls in various stages of dying, and evidence of butchery so extensive that hardened soldiers vomited at the sight. The Countess's methods included jamming pins and needles under fingernails and tying victims down, covering them with honey to be attacked by insects. Elizabeth showed no remorse. When confronted with the evidence of her crimes, she seemed almost proud of her work. She had transcended mere nobility, she claimed. She had discovered the secret of eternal youth, the key to cheating death itself. In her mind, the hundreds of murdered girls were not victims, but willing sacrifices to her greatness. The trial that followed was as much political theater as judicial proceeding. Elizabeth and her accomplices were put on trial for 80 counts of murder in January 1611. Her servants, deemed expendable, were executed with brutal efficiency, but Elizabeth's noble blood saved her from the headsman's axe, even as it had condemned so many others to die by her hand. Instead of execution, she faced a punishment perhaps more terrible than death itself. She was entombed alive within her own castle, walled up in a small chamber with only narrow slits for food and air. The woman who had bathed in blood, who had believed herself immortal, was buried alive within the very walls that had witnessed her crimes. For 3.5 years, Elizabeth Báthory lived in that stone tomb, her only companions the ghosts of her victims and the weight of her sins. The beauty she had murdered to preserve slowly faded in the darkness. The youth she had stolen drop by drop withered away in solitude. On August 21st, 1614, she was found dead, her body discovered by guards who had brought her meager meal. Some say her final years were filled with madness, that she would scream the names of her victims through the long nights, begging forgiveness from spirits who would never grant it. Others claim she remained defiant to the end, convinced that her crimes had been justified, that the lives of peasant girls were a fair price for her eternal beauty. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Elizabeth Báthory's story is not what she did, but what she represented. She was not a monster born in darkness, but a human being who chose to become one. She had every advantage that life could offer: wealth, beauty, power, education, and she used them all in service of an evil so profound that it still echoes through the centuries. The Blood Countess reminds us that the capacity for horror does not lurk in shadows or hide behind grotesque masks. Sometimes it wears silk gowns and jeweled crowns. Sometimes it smiles from portraits in gilded frames. Sometimes it rules from castle towers, cloaked in privilege and protected by power. Elizabeth Báthory believed that bathing in virginal blood would grant her eternal youth. Instead, her crimes assured that she would live forever in infamy, her name spoken in whispers, her story told as a warning across the ages. She sought immortality through the blood of innocents, but found only the eternal condemnation of history itself. In the end, the woman who murdered virgins for their blood discovered a terrible truth, that some stains can never be washed clean, that some sins echo through eternity, and that the price of trying to steal youth from the innocent is to lose one's own humanity forever. The castle still stands today, a monument to the darkness that can dwell within the human heart. And on certain nights, when the wind howls through the Carpathian mountains and mist rolls across the Hungarian countryside, some say you can still hear the screams of those long-dead girls, their voices carried on the wind like an eternal reminder that evil, once unleashed, leaves scars that time itself cannot heal.